Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. I hope you can hear me well. I will be holding my microphone today as I feel like this topic deserves a very more softer kind of approach. Um, so before we begin today's video, I do want to share a very important disclaimer. This episode we will be discussing, as you probably can see in the title, about child sexual abuse and the difficult question of whether victims sometimes go to become offenders themselves. This is a highly sensitive topic and it may be triggering for some viewers. So, if at any point you feel overwhelmed, please pause, take a break, and just step away for a while. If you're a survivor, I want to say with all my heart that your story is not defined by statistics. Most survivors never go to abuse others. You are not your trauma, and this video is educational in nature. I'm trying to draw on the developmental psychology and research, and it is not a substitute for therapy. So, if there's anything here that touches something deep for you, I strongly encourage that you reach out to a counselor, a trusted friend, or a helpline in your country. And above all, please know that you're not alone. So let's just get right into it now. Welcome back. This is our developmental psychology series, and today we're asking a very hard but important question, which is, do children who are abused grow up to be abusers themselves? And to put it another way, that there is a connection between being a victim of abuse in childhood and becoming a perpetrator in adulthood. So the short answer to this incredibly big question is that sometimes, but not always. And I guess the long answer is what we'll be exploring for the next next while together. We'll be looking at what research actually tells us because there are many myths around this topic. We'll be looking at how developmental psychology helps us understand the different pathways that abuse can take. And most importantly, we'll look at what can be done at the family, school, and community levels to break this harmful cycle and build some resilience. This is going to be a careful conversation, so I invite you to join with me gently, with compassion for yourselves and for others. So let's start with the basics. What is child sexual abuse, or commonly known as CSA for short? And what does this look like on a global level? So studies tell us that around 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 12 boys experience some form of sexual abuse before the age of 18. These numbers may even be underestimates because of the many cases that were never reported, which is just insane to think about. So what we know from this is that girls are far more likely to be victims than boys, which you can also argue that maybe boys aren't reporting as much as girls are. Nonetheless, yet when we look at perpetrators, the overwhelming majority are men. So even though girls are more victims than boys, men are more likely to be perpetrators than girls. And this is what researchers call the gendered paradox. So if the cycle of abuse were automatic, we would expect many more female perpetrators, but that's not what the data shows. So already we can see that abuse does not equal destiny. Most survivors never go on to offend. Instead, CSA acts as what psychologists call a general risk factor. What this means is that it increases the likelihood of many struggles later in life, such as depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, self-harm, substance abuse, or difficulties in relationship. Offending is just one of the many possible outcomes, and it is far more from the most common. And this is why developmental psychology uses the language of risk and protective factors. So risk factors push children closer to harmful outcomes, whereas protective factors act as a buffer of sorts, giving children more of a chance to heal and grow despite what they've endured. So, looking into the theories of the cycle, um, one of our articles showed that one of our psychologists, one of the theories, researcher nonetheless, has reviewed over 500 studies. So this is a very rather large scale um, analysis of many multiple research papers, and he's concluded that CSA is a general, non-specific risk factor. So, in other words, abuse increases vulnerability across the board, but it doesn't point in one specific direction. However, other theories suggest that when zoomed in on the question of cycle of abuse, they asked, "Do victims become offenders?" And and the answer was very nuanced. For girls, there was no evidence that CSA made them more likely to offend later, and the risk showed up in other ways, such as depression, PTSD, self destructive behaviors, but not always sexually offending. However, for boys, as you can imagine, very different, and there was a clearer pattern. It was not automatic, not universal, but present under certain conditions, and these conditions matter a great deal. So what this is trying to say that is that not all boys were who are who have been it's just so hard to talk about. This is why I have to read a script because there's just so much going on in my head. It's just a difficult conversation to talk about freely, so I think having a script really helps. But for boys, there's a general pattern of these factors that really kind of insinuates their response to their traumatic events of sexual assault. So these are the four, which are perpetrated gender. So boys who are abused by women or by both women and men were more likely to later offend, and this can deeply confuse a boy's developing sense of sexuality and power. Number two is severity and duration. So abuse that was long lasting, penetrative, or forceful can cause a higher risk. And so the longer the abuse, you can imagine the deeper the distortion of intimacy. Number three is age of onset. So abuse that began in adolescence at around 12 years old or older were specifically damaging. At this age, children are forming identity, sexuality, and peer connections, and so the abuse really disrupts that entire process. Number four is disclosure and secrecy. So when abuse was hidden, when disclosures were ignored, or when children were not believed, the sense of powerlessness was magnified. And so if there's one thread running through all of this, you can see the trend that's coming up is power. The abusers hold power, which makes the child feels powerless. And so sometimes years later, that powerlessness can be reenacted as a distorted attempt to regain control. So let's further break this down. While statistics can feel abstract, let's talk let's talk through a few composite stories drawn from the research. These are examples, these are not real life characters I'm about to talk to you about. What I'm about to talk to you about. We have three examples here, which is from Daniel, who is 13 years old, who had been groomed and abused by women in his neighborhood. His friends told him he was lucky, But Daniel was terrified and confused. His sense of consent and boundaries were blurred, and later he struggled with intimacy and respect in relationships. Michael is 7 years old. Abused by an uncle, he tried to tell his mother, but he wasn't believed. The secrecy and the betrayal left him angry, distrustful, and prone to risky, aggressive behaviors as a teenager. Sarah, 10 years old, abused by a family friend, but when she told her parents, they believed her immediately, sought therapy, and protected her. Sarah grew up with trauma, yes, but also the memory of being protected. She never reenacted abuse on others. These stories show that it's not only the abuser, sorry, that's not only the abuse itself, but it's also the response of adults that shapes the outcomes. Belief and support are powerful protective factors. Denial and secrecy deepens the harm. So, how do we break the cycle? We start by amplifying the protective factors, belief and validation. When children are believed, the cycle of secrecy is broken. It's therapy. Trauma informed counseling helps survivors process experiences and build healthier narratives. Safe attachments. Even one consistent, loving adult can be a lifetime. Opportunities for mastery, such as sports, art, education, or faith communities, can help children reclaim identity and agency. Psychological theory supports this too, such as Bendura's social learning. Love this one, which shows us that the positive role models can teach healthier ways of using power. And so does Erickson identity stage. This highlights that adolescence is a crucial time where abuse can distort self-concept, but also where support can repair it. Resilience research tells us that one stable relationship can buffer even severe trauma. So breaking the cycle is not about erasing trauma, it is about surrounding surrounding yourself with enough care that loosens the power to dictate the future. So of course, families can do this work alone, but systems and societies can play a huge role. Families often need communication and feel safe to disclose. Schools must train teachers to recognize trauma and respond with severe sensitivity. Communities such as churches, clubs, sports programs need to build safe cultures where children are heard and protected. And we must challenge the gender norms so boys are also allowed vulnerability. Okay, so let's turn to the direct question. Children who are abused grow up to be abusers themselves. Is this true? The answer is simply no, not automatically. It is a myth to think about abuse always leads to offending, but most survivors never abuse anyone. But the research does show a connection under certain conditions, such as for boys, risk rise of abuse were pretty severe, prolonged, began in adolescence, involved male, female, or multiple perpetrators, or, of course, or if disclosure was denied. These factors distort sexuality and power, sometimes fueling reenactment. Girls by contract, sorry, girls by contrast tend to internalize harm through depression, PTSD, or self-blame, but do not show increased rates of offending. So yes, there is a connection, but abuse is a risk factor, not a destiny. The presence of these protective factors, such as belief, therapy, support, makes all the difference. So as we close, I want to end with some hope. So survivors are not defined by what is done to them. Many grow to be compassionate, resilient adults, and abuse is an abuse of power. Healing is reclaiming power in healthy ways, such as power to speak your truth, power to set boundaries, power to form safe and loving relationships, power to know that you are more than your trauma. And for some, faith offers an anchor, the reminder that life has value and meaning, that they are loved and not forgotten. And for others, healing comes through therapy, art, advocacy, or connection. The cycles of harm can and do end. And every time a survivor is believed, every time a child is protected, every time community chooses safety over silence, we take another step to avoid this cycle from returning and are closer to a world where abuse has no place. So if you're a survivor listening today, please know you are not in your trauma. Healing is possible, and you do not have to walk this alone. Thank you so much for listening, guys. Hope you have a good day.